Which voting blocs could end up swinging this year's midterm elections? AEI Senior Fellow Karlyn Bowman will tell us all about the groups who may make a difference on this episode of Election Countdown. America's voters have greatly different backgrounds, experiences, and personal beliefs. Not surprisingly, these differences affect how people vote and even if they vote. Understanding the various groups that vote is crucial to understanding what's going on in an election and predicting what the results might be. AEI Senior Fellow Karlyn Bowman is an expert on these voting groups, and she's here to talk about them with us. Karlyn, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Karlyn, I want to start off by talking about one of the most publicized topics when it comes to talking about voting groups, and that's the gender gap, the difference in the ways men and women vote. And while it's obviously true that no voting group is completely monolithic, it's generally true that men tend to lead Republican and women tend to lead to the Democratic side. So Karlyn, you've been studying the gender gap for a long time. In fact, you wrote one of the first pieces on the gender gap back in 1982. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of the gender gap? How long has it been around? What causes it?
The gender gap is a permanent feature of our politics, and we've been looking at it ever since the 1980 election, when women voted for Ronald Reagan, but by a very narrow margin, but men voted for Ronald Reagan by a very significant margin overall, and thus the gap between male and female voters. We hadn't seen a gap in politics before that time. A lot of factors seem to combine to produce the gender gap, but it's been with us ever since.
All right, so how's the gender gap looking today? And are there any races in particular this year where the gender gap might make a difference?
Gender gap looks to be about the size that it's been in past off-year elections. I'm particularly interested in the races involving women, Jody Ernst in Iowa, Kay Hagan in North Carolina. I'm interested in whether women will vote for, in Kay Hagan's case, the Democratic candidate, whether women will vote in significant numbers in Iowa for the Republican candidate, Joni Ernst.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting to watch. Now, we think of the gender gap as being pretty big, but the marriage gap is even larger. Now, married people tend to lean to the right, where unmarried people tend to lean more to the left. Now, with more and more folks getting married later in life or choosing not to marry at all, this can have a noticeable effect on our politics and elections. Karlyn, how long have political analysts been talking about the marriage gap?
Actually, AEI ran the first article about the marriage gap by the late CBS analyst Martin Plister in 1983. Oh, wow. So we've been talking about it for 30 years, and it's a permanent feature of our politics, just as the gender gap is, and as you described it, married people tend to lean a little bit more Republican, unmarried Democratic.
Now, with people marrying later or even choosing not to marry at all, is this good news for Democrats?
It is good news for Democrats if their voters turn out, but married voters tend to be fairly reliable voters, and unmarried voters, many of whom are young, tend to be less reliable over time. So married voters have disproportionate weight on Election Day.
Okay, let's talk about race. The size and relative political influence of various racial groups are undergoing significant changes, and these groups also have wildly differing levels of turnout. Whites have been fairly Republican, blacks reliably vote Democratic, and Hispanics have been more centrist. Karlyn, the share of the white share of the population is going down, and the U.S. Census is predicting that whites will be a minority in this country by the year 2043. What sort of effect is this going to have on politics?
It's going to have a very big effect on politics going forward. If you think about going back to the 1972 election, whites were 90% of the electorate. In 2010, they were 77% of the electorate. That's a huge change overall. And we'll see that share declining ever so slightly in elections. But whites tend to be pretty reliable voters. They'll turn out in significant numbers. African Americans turned out at a higher rate in 2012 than did white Americans. They're a much smaller share of the population. It's growing very slowly, but they cast their votes overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates, as you suggested. Hispanics are still up for grabs. They're really punching below their demographic weight right now. A lot of them aren't registered, a lot of them aren't citizens, but as that changes, they'll play a more important role in our politics.
All right, that was a question that I had about Hispanic voters. You say they're punching below their demographic weight. Do you see that that's something that's going to change in the future?
Oh, I think it will, as they have more of a stake in the society, as they build families and businesses here. That'll certainly change over time.
Now let's finish up by talking about millennial voters, or voters who were born after 1980. A lot of ink has been spilled over the past few years on millennials, what they think, how they get information, and how they live their lives. But one of the things that we're really interested in is how they vote. So Karlyn, what do we know about millennial voters, and how long-lasting are their voting habits?
Yeah. Millennial voters aren't very reliable voters either. They constituted about 12% of the electorate in 2010. Seniors were almost twice that many, twice as large a share of the electorate in 2010. So again, they're not a significant voting group in terms of their demographic weight on election day. They'll be voting in more significant numbers as they age. We tend to think that marriage, mortgages, and children tends to bring you into the voting booth overall, and so they'll be more important going forward.
Right. There's just a question that I'm curious about, but we know that the millennial era starts in 1980, voters born after 1980. We don't have an end date on that yet, and so that would make it about a 35-year-long age group right now. That seems kind of long. So when do you think we're going to be defining the end of the millennial era?
Well, we need somebody to define the end of the millennial era, and perhaps that can be you. A generation is usually about 20 to 25 years in politics, and so we need an end date for the millennials, and we just don't have one yet.
Right. It's time for somebody to get on that. Karlyn, thanks so much for being with us today on Election Countdown. And thank you for watching. You want us to cover an issue on your state's elections? Let us know in the comments. Then please subscribe for all of the videos in this series. We'll see you next week.